The October sun beat mercilessly down on the cracked earth of Samuel Harper's cattle ranch, 40 miles southeast of Tucson. The year 1885 had brought nothing but hardship to this corner of Arizona territory. 3 seasons without decent rain had left the landscape scarred and brown, dotted with the bleached bones of cattle that couldn't find enough grass to survive. Sam wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he rode his mare Duchess along the dried creek bed that once brought life to his property. At 52, Sam had seen his share of struggles, but losing his wife Martha to fever 2 winters past had nearly broken him. The ranch that once bustled with hired hands and hundreds of head of cattle now felt like a ghost town, with only Sam and his aging foreman, Miguel Cordova, left to tend what remained of the herd. The mortgage payments to the bank in Tucson grew heavier each month, and Sam knew he was fighting a losing battle against time, weather, and circumstance. As Duchess picked her way carefully around a fallen cottonwood, something caught Sam's eye in the shade of the dead tree. At first he thought it might be a coyote, but as he dismounted and approached cautiously, his heart clenched. It was a young girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, lying motionless on her side. Her long black hair was matted with dust, and her buckskin dress was torn and stained with blood and dirt. Sam knelt beside her, his rancher's hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for signs of life. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and when he touched her shoulder, her dark eyes fluttered open. The fear that flashed across her face was immediate and intense. She tried to scramble backward, but weakness overtook her, and she collapsed again. "Easy now," Sam said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's eyes darted around wildly, taking in Sam's worn denim pants, faded cotton shirt, and the Colt revolver at his hip. She spoke rapidly in Apache, words that Sam couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear. She was terrified and preparing to fight or flee despite her obvious exhaustion. Sam had lived in Apache territory long enough to recognize the language, and he knew that finding an Apache girl alone and injured could mean trouble of the worst kind. The territorial newspapers were full of stories about raids, skirmishes with cavalry units, and the ongoing tensions as the government tried to force the remaining free Apache bands onto reservations. Many of his neighbors would have ridden away immediately or worse, but Sam Harper had never been able to turn his back on someone in need. "You're hurt and hungry," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. He pointed to himself. "Sam." Then he gestured toward his ranch house, visible in the distance. "Food. Water." The girl's eyes followed his gesture, then returned to his face. She studied him intently, as if trying to read his intentions in the lines around his gray eyes and the set of his bearded jaw. Slowly, she attempted to sit up, wincing in pain. Sam could see that her left ankle was swollen, and there were cuts on her arms and legs that suggested she'd been running through rough terrain. "Let me help you," Sam said, extending his hand. For a long moment, the girl stared at his outstretched palm. Then, with the desperation of someone who had run out of options, she reached out and grasped it. Her grip was surprisingly strong despite her condition, and Sam helped her to her feet. She immediately tested her injured ankle and nearly fell again. Without asking permission, Sam scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her frame thin from hunger. She tensed at first, then seemed to accept that she had little choice but to trust this gruff American rancher, who spoke gently and had kind eyes. As Sam carried her toward Duchess, the girl spoke again in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. Though he couldn't understand the words, he heard something in her tone that made his chest tighten. It was the sound of someone who had lost everything and was trying to hold on to the last shred of hope. "We'll figure it out," Sam murmured as he carefully helped her onto the horse before mounting behind her. "Whatever happened to you, we'll figure it out." Chapter 2. Crossing Boundaries. The ranch house sat like a weathered sentinel against the Arizona landscape, its adobe walls and tin roof bearing the scars of desert storms and relentless sun. Sam guided Duchess through the wooden gate, past the empty corrals where cattle once waited for the drive to market. Miguel Cordova emerged from the barn, his lined face creasing with concern as he saw the girl in Sam's arms. "¿Qué pasó, patron?" Miguel asked, hurrying forward. At 65, the Mexican vaquero had worked for Sam for over 20 years, and the two men understood each other with the shorthand of long friendship. "Found her collapsed by Miller's Creek," Sam replied, dismounting carefully before helping the girl down. "She's Apache, injured and half-starved." Miguel's expression grew troubled. Patron, you know what this could mean. If her people come looking, then we'll deal with it when the time comes, Sam said firmly. Right now she needs help. The girl stood unsteadily between them, her dark eyes moving from one man to the other as they spoke in English. She seemed to understand that they were discussing her fate, and her posture straightened with a dignity that impressed Sam despite her obvious vulnerability. Miguel shook his head, but moved to support the girl's other side. You always were too soft-hearted, amigo. Martha used to say it would get you killed someday. Maybe, Sam acknowledged, but it's what she would have done too. They helped the girl into the house, which still bore traces of Martha's touch despite 2 years of bachelor living. Faded curtains hung at the windows, and a few wildflowers, now dried, sat in a mason jar on the kitchen table. The girl's eyes took in everything: the stone fireplace, the simple wooden furniture, the rifle mounted above the mantel. Sam guided her to a chair at the kitchen table, while Miguel fetched water and clean rags. The girl watched their every movement with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. But when Sam placed a cup of cool water before her, she drank gratefully, draining it in long gulps. Easy, Sam cautioned gently. Too much too fast will make you sick. As if understanding his tone, if not his words, the girl slowed down. Sam began examining her injuries more carefully in the better light. The cuts on her arms and legs were from thorns and rocks, likely sustained during a desperate flight through rough terrain. Her ankle was badly swollen, and there were bruises on her wrists that looked suspiciously like rope burns. Miguel returned with medical supplies and began cleaning the girl's wounds with practiced efficiency. She flinched, but didn't cry out, watching Sam's face as if gauging whether she could trust him. When he smiled reassuringly and nodded, some of the tension left her shoulders. ¿Cómo te llamas?" Miguel asked in Spanish, hoping she might know some of the language many Apache had picked up through trading. The girl looked puzzled for a moment, then pointed to herself. "Ayana," she said clearly. "Ayana," Sam repeated, and she nodded. "That's a pretty name." As Miguel continued tending her wounds, Sam prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and dried beef. The girl, Ayana, watched him work, occasionally pointing to objects and speaking Apache words. Sam began to repeat them, making her lips twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile when he mispronounced them. When he set the plate before her, Ayana hesitated, then began eating with careful restraint despite her obvious hunger. Good manners, Sam noted. Whoever her people were, they'd raised her right. As the sun began to set through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor, Ayana suddenly stiffened. She cocked her head, listening to something Sam and Miguel couldn't hear. Then she moved to the window, peering out at the darkening landscape with obvious anxiety. "What is it?" Sam asked, but Ayana was already speaking rapidly in Apache, pointing toward the hills that surrounded the ranch. Miguel joined her at the window, his weathered hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I don't see anything, Patron." But Ayana was growing more agitated by the moment. She turned to Sam, her eyes wide with what looked like fear, not for herself, but for him. She grabbed his arm and spoke urgently in Apache, then tried gesturing, pointing to herself, then to the hills, then making cutting motions across her throat. "She's trying to warn us about something," Sam realized. That's when they heard it, the sound that had alerted Ayana's sharper ears. It was barely perceptible at first, like the whisper of wind through grass. But as darkness settled over the ranch, it became clearer, the soft rhythm of unshod horses moving carefully across hard ground, accompanied by the occasional creak of leather and the faint jingle of metal. Sam moved to blow out the oil lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Through the window, he could see nothing but shadows and starlight. But he knew with the certainty born of 20 years on the frontier that they were out there, silent, patient, and watching. Ayana had gone completely still beside him, her breathing shallow. When Sam looked at her in the dim light, he saw something that chilled him more than the presence of unknown riders in the darkness. In her eyes was the resignation of someone who had brought danger to people who had shown her kindness, and who was preparing to sacrifice herself to protect them. Sam placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and whispered, "We'll face whatever comes together." Outside, the darkness seemed to pulse with invisible watchers, and the night held its breath. Chapter 3. The Silent Vigil. The night stretched endlessly as Sam, Miguel, and Ayana maintained their vigil in the darkened house. Sam had positioned himself by the front window with his Winchester rifle, while Miguel watched the back door with his shotgun. Ayana sat between them at the kitchen table, her injured ankle elevated, but her eyes never leaving the windows. Hours passed in tense silence. Occasionally, one of them would catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows, a figure shifting position behind a boulder, the brief silhouette of a man against the starlit sky. But no shots were fired, no war cries echoed across the desert. The watchers maintained their positions with the patience of desert predators. "Why don't they attack?" Miguel whispered during one of their brief, hushed conversations. Sam glanced at Ayana, who seemed to understand the question despite the language barrier. She spoke softly in Apache, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and explanation. Though her words were incomprehensible to the two men, her gestures were clear. She pointed to herself, then to the darkness outside, then made a protective motion towards Sam and Miguel. "I think they're her people," Sam murmured. "And I think they're waiting to see what we do with her." As dawn approached, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold, the watchers remained invisible but present. Sam's eyes burned from lack of sleep, and his muscles ached from hours of tension. But as the first rays of sunlight crept across the ranch yard, something changed. A single figure emerged from behind the water trough about 50 yards from the house. He was a young Apache warrior, probably in his early 20s, with strong features and intelligent eyes. He wore traditional buckskin clothing and had a rifle slung across his back, but his hands were empty and visible. Most importantly, he bore a strong resemblance to Ayana. The girl gasped when she saw him, speaking his name. "Nalnish." Sam lowered his rifle slightly. "Your brother." Ayana nodded, tears suddenly streaming down her face. She moved toward the door, but Sam gently caught her arm. "Wait," he said softly. "Let's do this right." Sam handed his rifle to Miguel and walked slowly to the front door, his hands visible and empty. He opened it carefully and stepped onto the porch, aware that other weapons were probably trained on him from the surrounding rocks and brush. The young warrior, Naalnish, stood motionless, his dark eyes studying Sam with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. For a long moment, neither man moved. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and a hawk circled overhead, unaware of the human drama unfolding below. Then Sam did something that surprised even himself. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect he'd seen Apache use in trading sessions years ago. When he looked up, he saw something flicker in Nalnish's eyes that might have been approval. The warrior spoke in Apache, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. Sam couldn't understand the words, but he heard a question in the tone. "Your sister is safe," Sam called back in English, hoping his meaning would be clear from his tone and gestures. "She was hurt. We helped her." From behind him, he heard Ayana's voice, speaking rapidly to her brother in their native language. The exchange went on for several minutes, with Ayana occasionally pointing towards Sam and Miguel, her voice growing stronger and more insistent. Gradually, other figures began to emerge from their hiding places. Sam counted 5 Apache warriors, all young and well-armed, all watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion, but none of them appeared immediately hostile. Nalnish spoke again, this time directing his words toward the house. Ayana limped to the doorway, leaning against the frame for support. The reunion between siblings was subdued but powerful. Their relief at finding each other alive was evident even across cultural and language barriers. Sam remained on the porch, keenly aware that this moment could determine whether he and Miguel lived through the morning. Everything depended on what Ayana told her brother about her treatment at the ranch. After what felt like an eternity, Ayana finished speaking. Nalnish looked at Sam with new interest, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. The warrior took several steps closer, stopping about 20 feet from the porch. "You help, sister," he said in halting English, clearly struggling with the unfamiliar language. Sam nodded. She needed help. Anyone would have done the same. Nalnish's expression suggested he disagreed with that assessment. He gestured toward his companions, then spoke briefly in Apache. The other warriors relaxed slightly, though they remained alert. "Water?" Nalnish asked, pointing toward the well. Sam understood immediately. They'd been watching the house all night without access to water. "Of course. There's food too, if you're hungry." This offer clearly surprised the Apache warriors. Sam could see them exchanging glances, uncertain how to respond to such unexpected hospitality. Miguel appeared in the doorway, His weathered face creased with concern, but his manner respectful. "Patron, should I prepare food?" "Yes," Sam said quietly. "For all of them." Chapter 4. Unexpected Understanding. The breakfast that followed was unlike anything Sam Harper had experienced in his 20 years on the frontier. 7 people sat around his kitchen table and on makeshift seats brought in from the porch, 2 Mexican-American ranchers and 5 Apache warriors, with Ayanna serving as both guest and translator between worlds that rarely met in peace. The initial tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The Apache men sat stiffly, their weapons within easy reach but not threatening, their dark eyes constantly scanning the room and its occupants. Miguel moved carefully around them, serving beans, cornbread, and coffee, with the formal courtesy he might show to dangerous but honored guests. Sam watched Nalnish closely as the warrior ate. The young man had an intelligent face and carried himself with natural authority. When he spoke to his companions in Apache, they listened with obvious respect. This was clearly a leader, despite his youth. "Your English is good," Sam commented as Nalnish finished his second cup of coffee. "Mission school," Nalnish replied with a slight grimace, "before trouble." Sam nodded, understanding. He'd heard about the government's attempts to educate Apache children in white schools, and he could imagine the conflicts that might arise from such forced cultural assimilation. Ayanna spoke to her brother in Apache, gesturing toward her bandaged ankle and the clean wounds on her arms. One of the other warriors leaned forward, examining her injuries with what appeared to be approval of the medical treatment she'd received. "She says you found her dying," Nalnish said to Sam. "Could have left her. Should have left her, maybe." "No," Sam said firmly. "No one should leave a child to die alone." Something in his tone made all the Apache men look at him more intently. Nalnish translated, and Sam saw several of them nod with what might have been respect. The conversation gradually became easier as the morning progressed. Using a combination of English, Spanish, Apache, and gestures, they began to piece together Ayanna's story. She had been with a small family group, traveling to join relatives on the reservation when they were attacked by a cavalry patrol. In the chaos, she had become separated from the others and had wandered for days without food or water before collapsing near Sam's ranch. "Family?" Sam asked gently, dreading the answer. Nalnish's expression darkened. "All dead. Only we 2 left." The weight of that loss settled over the kitchen like a physical presence. Sam thought of his own grief after Martha's death and could only imagine what these young people had endured. "Soldiers said we were, how you say, hostile," Nalnish continued, his English improving as he relaxed. "But we only travel to reservation, have papers." He touched his shirt, where Sam assumed the documents were kept. "Papers not matter to soldiers." Miguel muttered something in Spanish that Sam was glad he couldn't fully understand, though the sentiment was clear enough. The old vaquero had seen enough military actions against indigenous peoples to have developed his own opinions about frontier justice. One of the other warriors spoke urgently to Nalnish, pointing toward the windows. The leader nodded and stood up. "We must go," he announced. "Dangerous to stay long in one place." "Where will you go?" Sam asked. Nalnish shrugged. "North, maybe. Find other Apache who still live free, or maybe reservation." His tone suggested neither option held much appeal. Ayanna stood as well, testing her injured ankle. She spoke to Sam in Apache, her voice warm with gratitude, then impulsively stepped forward and embraced him briefly. The gesture clearly surprised her brother and his companions, but none of them objected. As the Apache prepared to leave, Sam found himself reluctant to let them go. Something about their quiet dignity and the tragedy they'd survived had touched him deeply. "Wait," he said suddenly. "The army patrols will be looking for you, and winter's coming." Nalnish paused, his hand on the door. "What you say?" Sam looked around his empty ranch, seeing it suddenly with new eyes. The unused bunkhouse, the vast grazing land with too few cattle, the work that was too much for just him and Miguel. "Stay," he said simply. "Work for me. I need hands, and you need a place to be safe." The silence that followed was profound. The Apache warriors stared at him as if he'd suggested they fly to the moon. Even Miguel looked shocked. "You offer work to Apache?" Nalnish asked slowly. "I'm offering work to people who need it," Sam corrected. "People who helped me understand that doing right doesn't depend on what language you speak or what color your skin is." Nalnish translated rapidly for his companions. The discussion that followed was intense and animated, with much gesturing toward the ranch buildings and the surrounding landscape. Finally, Nalnish turned back to Sam. "We think about this. Very surprising offer." "Think all you want," Sam said, "but decide soon. There's a storm coming in from the west, and I'd rather have you safe under my roof than caught out in it." As if summoned by his words, a cool wind swept across the ranch yard, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. The Apache warriors exchanged meaningful looks, and Sam sensed that his simple offer had set in motion something far larger than any of them could fully comprehend. Chapter 5. New Horizons. 3 weeks later, Sam Harper stood on his porch watching something he never thought he'd see: Apache warriors working alongside Mexican vaqueros to repair fence lines while storm clouds gathered on the western horizon. The arrangement that had begun as a desperate offer during a tense morning had evolved into something none of them had expected: a functioning partnership that was slowly transforming the struggling ranch. Nalnish approached from the corral where he'd been working with Miguel to gentle a group of half-wild horses they'd found in a canyon to the north. The young Apache had proven to be an exceptional horseman, with an intuitive understanding of the animals that impressed even Miguel's decades of experience. "Rain comes tonight," Nalnish said, his English now noticeably improved after weeks of daily conversation. "Big storm." Sam nodded, studying the dark clouds building against the mountains. "Good. The land needs it, and so do we." It had been 3 weeks of careful navigation, building trust one day at a time. The Apache men had initially set up camp near the creek, maintaining their independence while testing whether Sam's offer was genuine. But as the days passed and their help proved invaluable, they had gradually accepted the use of the old bunkhouse, bringing their few possessions inside just as the first autumn cold snaps arrived. Ayana had recovered quickly from her injuries and had become an unexpected bridge between the different groups. Her facility with languages — she spoke Apache, Spanish, and was rapidly learning English — made her invaluable as a translator. More importantly, her presence seemed to ease the cultural tensions that arose when very different peoples tried to work together. "Patron," Miguel called from the barn, where he was securing equipment ahead of the storm. "The new cattle we brought in from the south pasture, they look good, fat and healthy." It was true. The Apache warriors' knowledge of the land had led them to hidden water sources and grazing areas that Sam had never discovered in his years on the ranch. Their tracking skills had helped recover strayed cattle that would otherwise have been lost to predators or theft. Most surprisingly, their reputation in the region, feared by some, respected by others, had effectively ended the cattle rustling that had plagued Sam's operation for months. "Rider coming," announced Taze, one of the younger Apache warriors, pointing toward the main road. Sam shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun and saw a single horseman approaching at a steady pace. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the uniform of the Territorial Marshal Service, and his stomach tightened with familiar worry. Marshal Jim Paulson was a decent man who'd known Sam for years, but he represented a legal system that didn't always distinguish between good Apache and hostile Apache. His presence could only mean that someone had reported the unusual arrangement at the Harper Ranch. "Everyone stay calm," Sam said quietly. "Let me handle this." Nalnish had already noticed the marshal's approach and was speaking in low tones to his companions. Without any obvious signal, the Apache men seemed to fade back toward the barn and outbuildings, not hiding, but making themselves less conspicuous. Marshal Paulson rode into the yard and dismounted with the weary movements of a man who'd spent long hours in the saddle. He was about Sam's age, with gray-streaked hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. "Sam," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Jim," Sam replied, stepping down from the porch to shake hands. "What brings you out this way?" "Got some reports from town," Paulson said, his tone neutral but watchful. "Folks saying you've got Apache working your ranch. Thought I'd better come see for myself." "That's right," Sam said simply. "They needed work. I needed hands. Seemed like a fair exchange." Paulson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sam, you know the situation with the Apache bands. The territorial governors put out orders about harboring hostiles." "These aren't hostiles, Jim. They're refugees. Their family group was attacked while traveling to the reservation with proper papers. The young woman was nearly dead when I found her." As if summoned by the mention of her story, Ayana appeared in the barn doorway. She walked with quiet dignity toward the two men. her posture straight despite the cultural tensions swirling around her. "This is Ayana," Sam said. "She speaks English now. Tell him what happened to your family, child." Ayana looked steadily at the marshal as she recounted her story in careful, clear English. Paulson listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled as she described the attack on her family's peaceful group. "You have those papers she mentioned?" Paulson asked when she finished. Nalnish emerged from the barn, moving with the controlled grace Sam had come to admire. He produced a leather pouch from his shirt and handed over several documents, travel passes, letters from reservation officials, and military safe conduct papers. Paulson examined them carefully. "These are legitimate," he admitted, "and recent." He looked up at Sam. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're taking a big risk here. Not everyone's going to understand." "I'm not asking everyone to understand," Sam replied. "I'm asking them to leave us alone to work our land and live our lives." A crack of thunder echoed across the valley, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Paulson looked around the ranch, taking in the repaired fences, the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle visible in the distance. "Place looks better than it has in years," he observed. "That's because I've got good people helping me take care of it." The marshal was quiet for a long moment, rain beginning to darken his hat and coat. Finally, he folded the papers and handed them back to Nalnish. "I don't see any hostiles here," he said officially. "I see a rancher and his hired hands working their land." He paused, meeting Sam's eyes. "But Sam, be careful. There are people who won't look as carefully as I did." As Paulson mounted his horse, Ayana stepped forward. "Marshal," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy she'd learned from watching Sam and Miguel interact with visitors. "Thank you for seeing truth." Paulson touched his hat to her. "Good luck, miss. All of you." As the marshal rode away through the increasing rain, Sam felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. The ranch that had felt like a burden for so long was becoming something new, not just a place to survive, but a home where different peoples could find common ground. Lightning illuminated the landscape as the storm arrived in earnest, and Sam watched his unlikely household hurry to secure the animals and equipment. Apache voices mixed with Spanish and English as they worked together against the weather, and for the first time in years, Sam Harper felt genuinely hopeful about the future. That evening, as rain drummed steadily on the roof, they gathered in the kitchen for dinner. The table that had felt too large and empty with just Sam and Miguel now accommodated 7 people comfortably. Ayana had prepared a meal that combined Apache, Mexican, and American traditions, a fitting symbol of what they were building together. "Tomorrow," Sam announced as they finished eating, "we start planning for winter and for spring. We're going to make this ranch something special." Nalnish raised his coffee cup in a gesture that had become familiar. "To new beginnings," he said in English. "To family," Ayana added, her voice warm with emotion. "To home," Sam concluded, and outside, the rain continued to fall on land that was finally ready to bloom again. The storm that had threatened to divide them had instead washed away the last barriers between peoples who had discovered that survival, hope, and human decency transcended any boundaries that fear and prejudice might try to impose. In the heart of the Arizona Territory, against all odds and expectations, they had found something precious, a place where different worlds could meet and create something stronger than any of them could build alone.